So earlier today, Joe Biden suggested that he could see himself picking a Republican to serve as his vice presidential running mate in the 2020 general election. And that while he wasn't thinking of a particular Republican, no one's leaping out in his mind, that if a Republican could work with him on bipartisan solutions and they could work together on a personal level, he'd be more than happy to pick a Republican as his VP nomination. Now, here's the problem. This is all part of a troubling trend from Biden that we've seen over the Democratic primary process, which is that he bends over backwards to ingratiate Republicans. Look, Biden has argued that it would be bad for the Democrats to clobber the Republicans in the next election. It would be bad because you need Republicans opposing Democrats to keep society functional. He's argued that, when Trump is gone, the Republican Party will go back to normal and, the bipartisan halcyon days will return and everything will be great. It's all fiction. It's all fiction from Joe Biden. The Republican Party does not offer constructive opposition. They do not offer constructive criticism. They do not offer a constructive alternative to the Democrats. They are a party of far-right totalitarians. They are a party of racists. They're a party that seems to relish in the fact that millions of people have poor working conditions, have poor living standards, have poor educations, have poor health care. And the idea that there's a bipartisan consensus with the Republican Party as it exists, not just with Trump as president, but the Republican Party as it has existed since at least the 1990s, if not much earlier, is absurd to me. It's absurd. Joe Biden is living in a fairy tale. And it shows that either Joe Biden is extremely politically naive, which is unacceptable given how many high offices he's held and for how long he's been in politics, or he fundamentally believes it's good and right and necessary to compromise with people who question the fundamental human rights and dignities of millions of Americans. That's the two choices. And either one looks bad, right? Either way, it looks bad. And I have to think it's a bit of both, frankly. If you look back to the Obama-Biden years when Biden was vice president, there was so much emphasis placed on bipartisan consensus building, on civil discourse, on reaching across the aisle, on finding common issues to work on with Republicans. And if the Democrats did that, the Republicans would respond in kind and act civil, or the voters would punish those Republicans for being babies in response to a very reasonable adult discourse from the bipartisan-leaning Democrats under Obama and Biden. And as we know, none of that happened. The Democrats took beating after beating after beating at the congressional and Senate levels. They lost the presidency. They lost the Supreme Court. They lost judgeships further down the judicial tree. They lost state legislatures all over the country. And at the end of the day, the Republicans won the decade. This decade was the Republican decade. And in part, that's because of the Democratic Party's naivete about compromising with a party that has no desire to compromise themselves. And Joe Biden wants to go back to that. He wants to go back to the policy that failed in almost every single election for the Democrats since 2010, with only a couple exceptions here and there. That's the strategy he wants. It's not a strategy that's going to work. But here's the thing. Maybe Joe Biden feels that the alternative, even if achievable, isn't palatable to him. The alternative, say a Bernie Sanders victory that, takes massive swings in the House and Senate and at the presidency and allows Bernie Sanders to bring the court back in balance and allows Bernie Sanders to pass wide-reaching progressive legislation with a quote-unquote clobbered Republican Party unable to resist. Maybe Joe Biden fears that. Because here's the thing. I don't necessarily think Joe Biden's a Republican. I'm not going to call Joe Biden a Republican. But here's the thing. Joe Biden is more like a typical Republican in his ideology and in his worldview than he is the growing progressive movement in the Democratic Party. People represented by Bernie Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez, and by the grassroots of young, diverse, working-class people asserting a bold progressive vision. Joe Biden doesn't trust those people. And so at the end of the day, Joe Biden isn't a Republican, but he'd rather work with a Republican, I feel, than he'd work with a progressive Democrat. Because at the end of the day, the bipartisan consensus for Biden is indeed part of a political naivete that the Democratic Party believes they can just play nice and the Republicans will come to work with them on a basis of mutual respect, which will never happen. But even if that never happens, the Democrats know that if they compromise with Republicans over and over and over again, the left will find it harder and harder to find momentum. That if the center always seems to be willing to compromise with the right, but almost never with the left, well, then the political discourse and the political policies, the Overton window, will gradually move further and further to the right. And they would rather have that than it move further and further and further to the left. That's why Joe Biden is open to picking a Republican, at least from a conceptual level, because he believes in this bipartisan consensus, even if it's a raw deal for Democrats. Because at the end of the day, it's a good deal for elite Democrats who fundamentally have the same class and ideological interests as much of the Republican Party, or at least they share more commonalities than either do with the growing progressive movement inside and beyond the Democratic Party. That's really the story here. And so Joe Biden may not end up picking a Republican. In fact, he's hinted that he wants to pick a person of color or a woman. And of course, there are members of the Republican Party who are women and people of color. But I think the hint is that he might lean towards picking a Democratic senator or political figure who is a woman or who is a person of color, likely relatively younger than Biden, to be his VP choice, which I think will help him win some credibility with elements of progressive voting bases. That's what I think he's going to do. But the fact that he even entertains picking a Republican and touting out these, Pollyannic visions of working together with a Republican Party that has shown no willingness to work together, and when it does seek compromise, it seeks compromise to fundamentally violate the human dignity of Americans, then I have to question Joe Biden's ability or desire to bring in any of the sorts of progressive legislation that are not just fringe ideas in the Democratic Party anymore, but are mainstream ideas held by all sorts of voters in that party, even if they don't happen to support Bernie Sanders. That increasingly those progressive ideas are becoming mainstream in the Democratic Party, and I just don't think that Joe Biden, if he's willing to pick a Republican, will have any meaningful commitment to those policies.